From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there. Welcome to our second edition of this week's Chicago Newsroom. I'm Ken Davis. You know, we're now dividing our show into two parts. The first is dealing with the mayor's race, and the second is taking a more in-depth look at four of the aldermanic runoff races. We have four races today in different parts of the city with very different demographics, and here to help us sort it all out is Mike Fourcher from Aldertrack, which Are you a nonprofit? Is it okay for me to say you guys are doing a real good job without it being a plug for a commercial product?
Why wouldn't you plug a commercial product? Yes, we are for profit. We're Aldertrack LLC officially. Hey, you know, if you're doing a good job, you know, you should tell people that.
You guys are doing a good job.
Thank you.
You're doing a very good job. I mean, we could sit here and just spend the whole half hour talking about that, about the need,
yes,
for
there
there
awesome.
to be a sort of an impartial news source that just covers the city council. That's a very cool thing. We haven't had that, and
thank you.
I'm happy that you're doing it.
We're excited too. We think that actually by treating the Chicago City Council like an actual legislative body, that they will respond in kind, and I think they are responding in kind, and I think they are excited. That's what we hear from them.
I'm just really glad to hear it. So we have invited you here today to play the game that we always play in our second show, which is to look at four different wards. And I asked you, I just arbitrarily asked you to do 2, 7, 45, and 46.
Yes.
So shall we begin?
Let's begin.
Let's begin. Let's begin with the second ward. The second ward is probably, in a lot of ways, the most interesting election that's going on because there have been these illustrations of it as a lobster.
Yes.
We always try to play this game and say, well, like, what would be a well-known intersection in the middle of this ward? Well, this ward, I mean, you could say North and Clybourne, but that would be like over here. And then there's the Drake Hotel over there, and God knows what all the way.
Yeah.
It is a nutty ward.
And
Thanks,
they hate
Dick
it.
Mel.
They hate it.
Yeah,
they hate it.
I'm sure they do. So we have two candidates.
Yes, Brian Hopkins, who is the former chief of staff to Cook County Board Finance Committee Chairman John Daly. He had been doing that for about 15 years. And Brian Hopkins, I refer to as the insider's insider, or the gatekeeper to the insider's insider. And then the other person is Alex Pattison, who is most recently an attorney for a white shoe law firm, but she also spent a lot of time.
That white shoe law firm is the one that Richard M. Daly now works at.
True.
All right. The one that did the parking meter deal.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's a big. I forget the name of the firm right now. But it's a big firm. Cat and Muchin, and you know it's a big firm. They have a lot of different clients. It's hard to pin responsibility for something like that on one attorney.
I just thought it was weird that one guy was the chief of staff for one brother, and she works. She's not connected with.
But
Rich
more
Daly,
importantly, though, actually, than the law firm is that she spent I think 10 years or so working for Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, both in political work and also in her congressional office. I think that's really much more what she's about than the law firm that she was fortunate enough to get hired to work at. So, you know, I think those relationships, those two groups are really very different. Jan Schakowsky's people have said, we're going to be behind Alex Pattison 1,000%. We're going to be working with her in order to get her elected, and we take this personally. The folks, the organization people, the Chicago Democratic Machine organization people have said, we're going to be behind Brian Hopkins 1,000%. And you can really see those two things going on. Jan Schakowsky has been actively lobbying for Alex Pattison in order to bring in endorsements and also money. People like Alderman Brendan Riley from the 42nd Ward, which had a big chunk of what is now the second ward, has been working very passionately, very directly for Brian Hopkins. He dropped mailers in the general election. Brian Hopkins actually was maybe the third highest fundraiser of the three candidates in the general election. And his campaign was stalling out in a big way until two things happened. The first is Victor Reyes and Mike Noonan who are lobbyists with an organization called the Roosevelt Group. Victor Reyes was the founder of the Hispanic Democratic Organization and former director of intergovernmental affairs for Mayor Richard M. Daley. And Mike Noonan is a super lobbyist, but also had ran the infamous campaign for Todd Stroger that got him elected after his dad died. So Mike Noonan and Victor Reyes, they know what's what and they know how to get things done in terms of elections. The other thing that happened that was important was Brendan Riley stepping into the race. He dropped 5 mailers that he paid for Brian Hopkins into the second ward. That's a lot of money. It's at least 50 grand. And he also ran a phone bank, at least he told me that he ran a phone bank practically every night for the last 3 weeks for Brian Hopkins. That's like having a whole nother campaign organization working for you. And as soon as that began to happen in the last 3 weeks, Brian Hopkins' campaign really began to take off. Until that point, it had really been Beta Boyne Rostro, who had been the second place candidate. So I think that there's a lot of outside forces that are going to be getting into this race.
So I mean, Pattison got only 24% in the first election, and Hopkins got 29%. So they weren't that far apart.
No.
And I think it's interesting that, everything I know from reading their stuff. So I'm just repeating back to the guy who writes it every
And it's all
morning,
true.
And then I
It's
read
all
it.
true.
And so yeah. But anyway, I think it's very interesting that he lives in Streeterville and she lives in Ukrainian Village. So, I mean, and they're pretty far away from each other, but they're in the same ward.
And she actually doesn't live in the ward, I believe. She lives a couple blocks out.
Oh, is that right?
Which is okay.
It's legal because
legal because the ward was just drawn, and you have an opportunity to move in some period of time after you're elected. There's also been a lining up of candidates for endorsements. I don't think Beta Boyne Rostro has made an endorsement yet, but Cornell Wilson, the 6th place finisher, and I can't remember who the other one is. Stacey Fingston, the 4th place finisher, have endorsed Brian Hopkins. And so the other is Steve Nikotopoulos. He is holding a debate on the 26th.
That's right. That's the big debate that's coming up.
Right. He's holding a debate, and he says after the debate he'll make his endorsement.
Make his decision. Well, that's a cool thing to do. And of course, one of the big issues, and we've got to move on, but one of the really big issues in the ward is the whole Finkel-Steele thing and what to do with Finkel-Steele.
Yep.
And that is
the old site. And Finkel-Steele has now moved down to I think Pullman. So.
Yeah. What will happen there? We do have to keep rolling because we got 3 more to do. So let's move on. Let's move south to the 7th ward. We have Natasha Holmes and
Alderman Natasha Holmes.
Mitchell. Alderman Natasha Holmes was appointed by our mayor.
So the 7th ward is a chunk of South Shore. It's the South Shore neighborhood as well as a good chunk of South Chicago. South Chicago is one of the highest homicide rates zones in the city. South Shore is a somewhat middle-class African-American neighborhood. My grandmother grew up there, and it's a nice neighborhood. Natasha Holmes was appointed by Mayor Rahm Emanuel after a weird situation where Sandy Jackson Jr. had been the previous alderman, and she resigned. And she had a chief of staff, Kiana Barrett, and Kiana Barrett was expected that she was going to be named to the slot by Mayor Emanuel.
And said so publicly.
Well, she didn't actually say so.
It was said of her.
There was a column by, I believe, Mary Mitchell. And Mary Mitchell wrote a column where she actually heard a conversation from Sandy Jackson Jr. where Sandy Jackson said,
a commonly made mistake.
Sandy Jackson said, I control this ward and I'm going to have Kiana Barrett be named. And Mary Mitchell wrote a column that said that didn't look good for Mayor Emanuel, so he could not appoint Kiana Barrett. Kiana Barrett ran a very aggressive race. It seemed as if it was going to be Kiana Barrett and Natasha Holmes that would come to the runoff. It was a big surprise that Kiana Barrett didn't make it. Gregory Mitchell, who is a young man, he's an IT manager, is the 2nd place candidate. There were 8 candidates in the race. Natasha Holmes came up with 25%, and Gregory Mitchell came up with about 20%. We have tried to get in touch with Gregory Mitchell for some weeks at Aldertrack. We have tried to have a sit-down interview with him, and we've tried to interview with him, and he has remained pretty much a cipher to us. His staff have been, his team, I guess, have been very protective of him, suspicious of anybody that's not part of their group. So we've had a real hard time actually sitting down and interviewing him.
Mm-hmm. So, but we do know that Natasha Holmes has been alderman for a couple of years, right?
For 2 years.
About 2 years. And that interestingly enough came about after this very highly publicized thing that Mayor Emanuel kind of said, I'm not gonna do what's been done in the past, where I just like with a stroke of my pen appoint someone.
Right.
I'm going to have everybody come in. We're going to have a
Right.
cattle call, and
Right.
did all that, and he decided on.
And Natasha Holmes put in her application, and she was plucked out of nothing. Mm-hmm. She was nobody sent.
Yeah.
Which makes her the perfect appointment for a mayor, because the only person that she sent that sent her was Mayor Emanuel.
Yeah.
And she has been very explicit. She is endorsing Rahm Emanuel. How much she will be doing to help him, she actually has not been so explicit.
And of course, how much he'll be helping her is interesting, because in that ward, I would imagine his name is, at least in large parts of the ward, might be a liability. So it could hurt her.
You know, it's 6 of one, half a dozen of another. I don't think that there's really a monolithic vote in the African American community.
No, we've seen that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so that's really about all we know about the 7th Ward at this
Yeah.
moment, but we'll talk about it more as we know more. Let's move north. And now we got a couple of very fun wards to talk about here. The 45th Ward, John Arena and John Garrido started fighting with each other in 1936.
Yeah, so you're giving me the grudge match list here.
Yeah.
So John Garrido and so Alderman John Arena ran against John Garrido 4 years ago in 2011, and it actually went to a runoff then. And then John Arena, I think, won by less than 100 votes or so.
It was 30.
Yeah, it was 30 votes. And John Garrido charged fraud and all kinds of other stuff. There's been clearly John Arena has some anger management issues. He's been caught yelling and screaming at people, shoving, all kinds of stuff. I think that he's managed to control that in the last few months. And John Garrido, that part of the city, the 45th Ward is in the far northwest side, includes Sauganash and Oriole Park, those areas. And John Garrido has support of a lot of the firefighters.
Yeah.
Or, I'm sorry, not firefighters, police officers.
He's
a police lieutenant. He's a police lieutenant. There's a lot of cops up there that are helping him. And you see, all these guys that are out putting up signs for him. John Garrido signs are everywhere up in that part of the city.
I was going to say that I live nearby. I'm not in that ward, but I'm just stunned. I've never seen the kind of signage like this guy has. I mean, you drive down any block in the 45th Ward, and there'll be 2 or 3 of these massive signs.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, he's got a lot of money, I guess.
Well, he's putting it all into signs maybe, or he's got a good print deal. Who knows?
Yeah. But it's interesting that I've been looking, and I just don't ever see arena signs. I think I've seen 3.
He's got some billboards here and there,
Yeah.
and I think that he spent a lot more money on mail.
I see.
And I think he may have had a commercial at some point. There was another interesting side story. There was a third candidate in the general election this year, a woman named Michelle Barrett, who is also very heavily involved in firefighters. She was part of a group called the 100 Club, which helps families of deceased first responders, police and firefighter. And the story that we were told was that she shopped around to the various campaigns, to the Garrido and Arena campaigns, and said, hey, I've got some campaign debt. If you help me pay it off, I'll endorse you. The Arena campaign says, forget about it. And the Garrido campaign, well, they're not willing to say, but she later then went and endorsed Garrido. Who knows if that's going to be enough in order to put him over the top.
Yeah. Well, the issues, what I find about this is that fascinates me, is that the issues are really kind of very policy wonk issues in a lot of ways. I mean, John Arena, who is obviously a critic of the mayor, and that's part of the reason
of the Progressive
why he's
Caucus.
been targeted by the mayor. But I mean, he advocates things like TOD, transit-oriented development, which means that you take a place like one of the Blue Line stops in here, like Jefferson Park stop, and you build higher concentrations of apartments around that because you want to encourage people to live in the dense city and blah, blah, blah.
And that's actually one of the big issues, is building more development around the Jefferson Park downtown area, the Blue Line and Metro stop and the big bus stop that's there. You know, that actually has been a really big issue in that community for a long time.
Very long time.
Jefferson Park is a kind of neighborhood that doesn't change a lot. There's a lot of white ethnics that have lived there for a long time. And so there are some folks who say, look, we have this incredible transit hub. We should be building office buildings, apartment buildings. It's right next to the expressway. This should be a big place with a lot of development. People who have lived in Jefferson Park for a long time say, no way, we don't want more traffic. We like it exactly the way it is.
Like Alderman Ed Bus says, keep it like it was.
Keep it like it was, and I think that's what they're fighting for. Also, airport noise is a big issue.
It's a huge issue, yeah. So, and I know that there's a new battle that's just broken out up there at forgive me, the high school, the big high school, where they wanted to close a Taft High School. They wanted to close one of the nearby streets to increase the size of the athletic field or something, and they were on opposite sides on that one. So
I think every last tiny little neighborhood issue, they're going to be picking opposite sides.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's a ward to watch. I mean, you got any early predictions on that one? It's going to be pretty tight, I guess, right?
Bloody and bruised. I mean, we'll maybe do polling later on, but I think right now it's just too hard to tell.
I mean, I heard that Garrido's people are walking around with signs with 30 on it, you know, just saying this is how much we lost by last time. We're not going to let it happen again.
That's right.
And also, now let's move on. 46 is a ward that truly fascinates me because it's one of the most fascinating wards in Chicago. It's uptown. It's this polyglot thing, and James Kappelman. Well, I mean, you can tell the story, but you know, you have the Schilleristas, who were Helen Schiller people, were there for
former Alderman Helen
years.
Schiller.
And James Kappelman comes along, and he's got a whole different kind of view of what Uptown should be.
Well, Uptown is a place that has a very clear black-white divide. It's the largest African-American community in the city on the north side. It also has a very clear rich-poor divide.
Sure does.
And there are a lot of social service agencies that are there, and then there's also a lot of very fancy high-rises. There's also a Republican-Democrat divide. The south part of the ward, south of Montrose along Lakeshore Drive, has a large number of Republican voters. I think actually Lynn Martin lives in an apartment building down there,
right?
Former congresswoman and Bush Secretary of Labor. So, you know, there is a clear divide in that ward in a lot of different ways. And Helen Schiller was a very divisive alderman for a long time, managed to hold on, I think, just by dint of her incumbency, and she finally announced her retirement. It was a real scrum, a real fight in 2011. Kappelman got elected, I think, in part because there was this thinking that, well, a gay former priest social worker must be a pretty liberal guy, and so he'll work well for this ward. And Kappelman, I think, really kind of wrote in on that.
Except that in his ward, a gay former priest social worker is just pretty much a guy on the street.
Right. Well,
he's
he's just another guy, and I think a lot of people figure, well, this is the kind of people that we would have in the ward. He has turned out to be, in a lot of ways, a very aggressive personality, and I think that more than anything, the problems that people have with him are about personality rather than policy, and that he has had trouble connecting with people in the ward. Amy Crawford, the candidate this time around,
we haven't mentioned her yet. She's his opponent.
She's his opponent in the runoff. Has really zoomed in on that, and she is also openly gay, and she has really made an issue out of his not being able to connect with people, him being brusque, more than policy. It's really not about policy. And he also has made some mistakes where he has said things like, hey, look, we're working hard on improving crime in the ward, and there's all kinds of things that are being done in the ward to improve crime. But people in the 46th ward, that's a part of the city where there are still gunshots, there are still people shot. There are people shot and killed on Sheridan Road, which is a big road up there, a big street. And I think that he has painted himself, he has attached himself to those problems, and he can't get away from it.
And I'm seeing that Amy Crawford is kind of trying to portray herself as being somewhere in between the Schiller wing and the Kappelman wing, that she can be the connective tissue.
And she's been somewhat successful with that. Actually, the other day she got the endorsement of the third candidate that was in the general election race, Denise Davis. And Denise Davis was Helen Schiller's chief of staff. So that's a pretty legitimate connection to the Schilleristas. We'll see. Denise Davis was the only African-American candidate in the race. We'll see how much Denise Davis is actually able to bring with her, if she really has any coattails.
How much credence do you put in this this criticism of Kappelman that he was really insensitive to poor people being displaced by massive development in the ward? I mean, there were a number of these really iconic battles that went on. Mark Brown wrote extensively about these buildings, former SROs being just emptied out overnight, and they weren't all in his ward, but many, I think most were, and that he appeared to be kind of unsympathetic to the people who were being thrown out of these buildings.
I think there's truth to that, but there's a couple of things that have been going on. The first is that it has been an ongoing policy by former Mayor Daley and Rahm Emanuel to be decreasing support for things like SROs, and that has been a city policy. I think that Kappelman is catching it in the neck a little bit about that. He probably could have done a lot more in terms of his optics and seeming sympathetic, and maybe soften the blow somewhat. But when a developer comes in and they buy a building and the city is no longer really supporting a previous use for that kind of building, the alderman doesn't have a lot of choice. They either got to go along with it or they don't. Like I said, I think he probably could have done some things in order to soften the blow.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would push back on that a little bit and say aldermen, even in today's environment, still have a lot of control over what development goes on in their ward. And
not as much as I think. I think on the smaller things, but when you begin to get into larger apartment buildings and things like that, the fifth floor really does weigh in a big way. And I mean, there's a lot of, and I wish I could quantify this for the audience, because I know that this is just me talking. But there are a lot of cases, if you're able to sit down and talk with aldermen, they say, look, the pedal was on, the foot was down on this one. There's not a whole lot I can do. Maybe Kappelman could have yelled and screamed a lot more. Well, not maybe. Definitely he could have screamed a lot more. And I think that that's what he's getting tagged with.
Very interesting. It's really interesting to watch that race. We've got just a couple of minutes left. I just kind of, while I have you here, I just want to be a little bit jealous with the time I have with you, and kind of look at the sort of the bigger picture of this runoff. We have 19, but maybe it's only 18 races now, because what has anything happened? The 12th was supposed to be the big day for the Dick Mell thing, right?
Yesterday the Board of Elections.
I said Dick Mell for the Deb Mell. My apologies.
You know what?
Deborah.
And I didn't catch that either. So it says a little something. Yesterday,
it's like Jackson Jr.
Right. Yeah. Sandy Jackson Jr. Yesterday was when the Chicago Board of Elections conducted their final count of absentee ballots and provisional ballots. And their unofficial tally yesterday was that Deb Mell was 17 votes ahead.
17.
And so she avoids a runoff by 17 votes. Today, the Board of Elections met to certify those results. Tim Meegan, who was the number 2 candidate, his attorney Rich Means was there, and we reported it. We were tweeting it out today, that Rich Means made the argument that the Board of Elections should have counted every single vote, including ones where people voted for a non-candidate on the ballot. If that had actually happened, according to Means, then there would have been enough votes in order to make it not into a runoff. That's how close it is. So
Oh,
people
you're
who
saying
go
the universe of ballots would have
if you included
that number would have
if you
risen.
included people who voted for none of the above,
Right,
if you
right.
included the people who voted for
I
Mickey
see
Mouse,
what you're saying.
that would have
Oh,
been enough
yeah,
in order
yeah.
to make it so that
Because
there would have
it's
been
50 then it should be 50% plus one of everybody who voted, not
Right.
just people who voted for valid candidates.
That was the argument
It's an
by
interesting argument.
by election attorney Rich Means on behalf of Tim Megan.
Yeah.
Langdon Neal, the chair of the Board of Elections, said no. A candidate has to declare their intent as a candidacy in order for those votes to be counted, and so they certified the 33rd Ward results. The next step is last week on the deadline, 33rd Ward candidate Tim Megan from the general election filed for a recount in the Cook County Circuit Court. And so that goes to court, and I'm not sure when the next hearing is, but that now grinds through the court. And what they are saying is that there were a series of different frauds that were committed, that election judges were helping people vote. Election judges were helping people vote, which is not legal, and that there was a widespread fraud that was committed with absentee ballots in senior homes, where people were being encouraged to vote for Deb Melt. Now, I gotta say, my father is in a senior home. He's not with it. I can totally see how that works.
Oh, well, it's one of the great Chicago traditions. You wait when you're in a
Right.
tight race. You wait for the senior homes to come in.
And it's
Yeah.
a very thin line
Yeah,
between
yeah,
helping and guiding.
So, I mean, at this point, do you have a read on will there be a ballot in the 33rd Ward?
No idea.
No one knows.
Well, and the thing is that judges are traditionally very loath to call for recounts.
Yeah, yeah.
Because it means that they are saying that another branch of government, the administrative, is not doing their job.
Right.
And they are casting doubt on a very important element of democracy
Yeah.
in order to be able to be conducted
Yeah.
fairly.
1 minute left, and I want to ask you if you have any sense of, I know yesterday was the last day Tuesday was the last day for registration for this election, so theoretically registration could have gone up a little bit. In just a few seconds, do we have a sense of where that went, and what, if anything, would it mean to the mayor's race?
So we haven't talked to the Board of Elections about that in order to get a count from them yet. Although I'll say that most of the campaigns that we've spoken to about what are you doing in order to get ready, and we've spoken to all the runoffs and a lot of other aldermen that are running campaigns for the mayor races, they've said we're not really focused on anything other than reminding people that there's a runoff and making sure that they go out. There's a lot of angst and concern among campaigns that people are going to be not paying attention because it's spring break for both CPS and Catholic schools the day of election.
So that's where we're going to have to drop it. But it's going to be really interesting to see, because if there are huge numbers, that might have some impact, and if there aren't, it might not, or it might be the other way around. It's hard to say.
Who knows?
Well, Mike, thanks so much for being with us today, and thanks for all the work that you guys have been doing.
We're having
really
a great
good.
time. Thank you very much.
I can tell that you are. Mike Fourcher from Aldertrack, and you can get them at aldertrack.com. And you have been watching Chicago Newsroom. It's a community service of CAN TV. You know that. We're here all the time. You can find us here on cable, but you can also see us online at this address. Watch us at any time. You can catch our podcast, and you can see us next week when we do 2 more shows. First one will be the mayoral, and then we'll do 4 more wards next week. And we got some very special guests coming in next week. I hope you'll check us out. All right, thanks very much. I'm Ken Davis. See you next week on Chicago Newsroom. Bye.